Hello and welcome to Knife Chats. If you noticed, I skipped the first introduction simply because this is going to be long enough as it is. Uh, Big Red EDC asked if I would share my thoughts on the past, present, and future open tag event that was actually started by Metal Complex. And it sounded like a really cool thing. I liked watching Big Reds, and so I thought, yeah, I will definitely do that. But you know how I ramble. I talk more than I really should, and I really was having a difficult time trying to sum this up in like 15 or 20 minutes. So what I decided to do is just go ahead and break this up into four different videos. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to release all four videos at the same time on January 1st. And this is part one, which will be the beginnings or the first half of the past. And then there will be a second half of the past, which will be more like the recent past. And then I'll have a section on the present and a section on the future. And so let's go ahead and get this thing started.
Where it all began with the past, present, and future open tag event would have to be the distant past. So I'm going to have to split the past into two parts, distant and more recent past. Because in the distant past, it was more of an accumulation of knives as opposed to an actual collecting of knives. But that accumulation led directly into collecting knives. And by accumulation, I really mean accumulation. This is the very first knife I ever owned, and I consider myself fortunate that I still have my first knife. We're talking about back in pre 1975, maybe 73, 74. That's when I actually ended up getting this knife. And I did not buy it. I actually found it in my high school. If you see there, it had a broken scale. I since repaired the scale. I think I repaired the scale sometime when I was in college, but I carried the knife with the broken scale for a while. Really could not afford any knives, and what you're seeing here is just a 7-inch stiletto, 4-inch handle, 3-inch blade. Notice stainless Italy, nothing special about it. But this was the first knife that I could ever call my own. Before then, if I needed to cut something, it was run off to the kitchen, grab a knife from the kitchen drawer and use it. Matter of fact, I remember making sheaths out of cardboard and carrying a knife like that before I had this knife, and it's just a steak knife out of the kitchen. But if you needed a knife on you for something where you're going to go cut something, well, that's the way it was. Didn't have a whole lot of money, so that was the very first knife I ever had, and it's because I was lucky enough to find it in my high school. The second knife I ever got was right here, and again, this was a street find. It doesn't work perfectly well. I remember when I found it, me and a friend saw it at the same time on the street. I actually said, "Hey, look at the knife," and he picked it up and he said, "Mine," and then he opened it, and if you notice, watch this, it didn't open right. So he said, "Forget it, you can have it if you want it," and he dropped it back on the ground. I picked it up and I said, "I'll take it," and this doesn't always open right, but if you leave it pointing downward, eventually that blade will lock. Imperial USA, just a little keychain switchblade. Doesn't operate perfectly well, but that's all right by me. I keep it now more for sentimental values than anything else because, it's the second knife I ever had. First, then number two. This is not the third knife I ever got, but it is similar to the third knife I ever got. And this is the one of the first knives. This is actually the second knife I ever bought, and I bought it to replace the first knife I ever bought, which was exactly the same as this, except instead of having a 1981 tang stamp, it had a 1978 tang stamp. And what it is one of those demo knives or military utility knives, the MIL-818K or by Camillus. I've got videos on this, so I'll just post a link to it. I'm not going to go through a lot of detail on it, but I will tell you that the reason I don't have the first one anymore and why I ended up replacing it is because I traded the first one for this knife, which is a German Army knife, in this case made by CCM. And what I had done is I had traded my very first knife of the 1978 variety demo knife for this knife with a German soldier. And right after I got back to right after I got back to post, I went and bought a new one to replace the one I had, which I suspect is the same thing that the German soldier did. He went and bought a new German Army knife, but now he had a souvenir demo knife, and I had this knife. And I actually used this one and carried this one while I was in the Army after trading for this one. Because quite frankly, there were things on this. this was the killer on it, right there, the saw blade. This does not have a saw blade, and I use that saw blade quite frequently. So really like the German Army knife and used it quite often. And that was the first knives I ever had, and that was the genesis of my knife collecting right there. I ended up in 1984-85 with these 4 knives plus a Spanish Mauser bayonet and a Camillus Mark II fighting knife. And that was all the knives I had at the time. And then I asked for a Swiss Army knife for Christmas, and this is the one I got. I had specified that I did not want tweezers or toothpicks, but I wanted one with a saw blade. Not a saw blade, a pair of scissors. In any case, this is the knife I ended up getting, which is the Woodsman, and it does have both the scissors, and it also has a saw blade. So it is basically the Victorinox Huntsman, but with no toothpick or tweezers. And I used and carried this knife for many, many years. Very happy with it. You can tell, beat up a little bit, but a terrific knife. And shortly thereafter, year or so after, actually probably more like about 6 or 7 years after having carried this one for a while, I found this knife on the street. I found a lot of knives. I guess I'm a lucky person. And it is a Wenger with a pair of scissors. And the scissors work really cool. And I like the little dangly keychain thing. So I started swapping this knife out with this one, carrying this one or this one back and forth. And then occasionally I would even carry this one or this one. And what I really liked about this one was the Wenger is that it had a nail file. And I actually used the nail file quite often, so I started carrying this one quite a bit. And then lo and behold, I find another street find knife, another Wenger. I wonder if it was the same person who lost this one. I thought these two knives were identical with the exception of the screwdriver in place of the corkscrew. And so I started carrying this one for a while with the screwdriver, and I liked it quite a bit. And then after carrying it for, I don't know, a couple months or so, I noticed that besides the scissors, this thing next to it was not a really super thick liner, but was actually a saw blade. That's right, I carried this knife for at least a month or more before I realized it also had a saw blade. So it is basically the Wenger version of this without the corkscrew. It has a Phillips screwdriver in place of it, so it's like the Victorinox Fieldmaster. And that was really it for my pocket knives. These were all the pocket knives I had. And was pretty much satisfied with it and wasn't even thinking of doing anything else, buying any more knives or anything else. I was quite happy with these, and I would rotate them. Well, didn't rotate these two, but I rotated between those 5 knives for carrying for quite some time. And then one day I was in Kentucky visiting our relatives, and my uncle showed me his small collection of case knives. And that brings us to the next installment, which is the more recent past, where I actually decided maybe I want to do something like collect pocket knives. And that's where it really started, when I saw my uncle's case knife collection.
And so concludes the beginning of my knife collecting hobby. At this point, it was really more of a knife accumulation kind of thing, but it had to start somewhere, and that's where it started. Let's move on to part 2, the more recent past and how it came about.